The end of the world did not begin with a declaration of war, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. In less than 4 minutes, every military satellite orbiting Earth went completely dark, leaving humanity totally blind as the sky above swallowed the sun. Panic swept across the globe with the speed of a plague. In the high-security bunkers of Geneva, Washington, and Beijing, world leaders stared at dead screens and flashing warning lights. The global defense grid, a multi-trillion-dollar shield designed to intercept intercontinental ballistics, folded like wet paper. It was not a malfunction. It was a localized disruption of Earth's magnetic field, orchestrated by a fleet of vessels so massive they possessed their own gravitational pull. The Kalan Armada had arrived. They hung in the upper atmosphere like jagged shards of obsidian, completely defying the laws of aerodynamics. They were silent, colossal, and utterly indifferent to the jets scrambling desperately to meet them. Radar operators wept as they realized the scale of the invasion. These were not scout ships. This was an extinction fleet. Military leaders, stripped of their communication networks and their pride, quietly began issuing the final protocols for the survival of the human species. The end of days had arrived, and it wore a face of smooth black metal, far below the floating leviathans, in a quiet rural stretch of American heartland. Arthur Pendleton sat on his worn wooden porch and watched the apocalypse unfold. Arthur was 72 years old, a retired high school history teacher with a bad knee and a profound appreciation for single malt scotch. He sat in his favorite rocking chair, a crystal glass resting perfectly balanced on his thigh. Around him, the cicadas had gone completely silent. The wind had died. The air tasted heavy with ozone and the scent of impending rain, though there was not a single cloud in the sky. There were only the ships. He took a slow sip of his drink, feeling the familiar comforting burn slide down his throat. As a historian, Arthur had spent his entire life studying the rise and fall of empires. He had lectured on the sacking of Rome, the collapse of the Bronze Age, and the brutal efficiency of the Mongol hordes. Looking up at the monolithic structures blotting out the afternoon sun, he felt a strange sense of academic detachment. It seemed the universe was just repeating the same violent cycles on a much grander scale. A shadow fell over his property, darker than a total eclipse. Arthur did not run. He did not barricade his doors or reach for the hunting rifle gathering dust in his hall closet. He simply watched as a single dropship detached from the main fleet. It was a terrifying wedge of spiked armor and pulsing blue exhaust, plummeting toward the Earth at a speed that should have incinerated it. Instead of targeting a military installation, a major city, or a communication hub, the colossal craft banked sharply. It fired a series of deceleration thrusters that ignited the air itself, tearing a shockwave across the quiet valley. The ship slammed into Arthur's prized cornfield. The impact kicked up a tidal wave of pulverized soil and shredded stalks. The ground heaved violently, rattling the foundation of Arthur's farmhouse and nearly spilling his scotch. He placed a hand over his glass to protect it from the falling debris, coughing politely as a cloud of dust washed over his porch. The vessel hissed, venting a cloud of superheated vapor that scorched the remaining crops. It was easily the size of a commercial airliner, armored in interlocking plates that seemed to shift and breathe. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of cooling metal ticking in the ruin of the cornfield. Then the heavy frontal ramp slammed into the dirt. A figure stepped out of the steam. Supreme Commander Vael stood over 7 feet tall, clad in a biomechanical suit that looked entirely organic and entirely lethal. Every angle of her armor was designed for intimidation, from the spiked pauldron guards to the glowing insectoid optical sensors of her helmet. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, stepping over burning cornstalks as if taking a casual stroll through a park. Behind her, Rows of heavy shock troops waited in the shadows of the ship, their weapons drawn and thrumming with lethal energy. Arthur remained seated. He took another sip of his scotch, his pale blue eyes tracking the towering alien warlord as she crossed the distance from the crater to his front steps. She stopped at the edge of his lawn. The sheer mass of her armored frame cast a long, imposing shadow over the porch. The helmet of the suit folded back in a seamless cascade of interlocking scales, revealing a face that was strikingly humanoid, yet undeniably alien. Her skin was a pale, iridescent silver, her eyes entirely pupilless and glowing with a faint, violet luminescence. Sharp, angular features gave her an expression of absolute, unyielding authority. This was a being who commanded the destruction of worlds, a general who had likely erased entire civilizations from the cosmos. She looked down at the old man in the rocking chair. Arthur looked back. He tilted his head slightly, studying the contour of her face, the defiant set of her jaw. A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. The Supreme Commander's armor hissed. The glowing energy lines running down her arms dimmed. She took a step forward, bridging the gap between the scorched earth and the wooden steps of the porch. Then, in a gesture that defied every known protocol of war, she dropped to her knees. The impact shook the floorboards. She reached out with heavily armored arms, ignoring the dangerous proximity of her razor-sharp gauntlets to his fragile human frame, and wrapped him in a desperate, crushing embrace. "Mr. Pendleton," she whispered. Her voice was filtered through the suit's translation matrix, but the raw, trembling emotion beneath the synthetic output was unmistakable. She buried her silver face in the collar of his worn flannel shirt. Arthur chuckled, a warm, gravelly sound, and awkwardly patted the massive, armored shoulder pad. "It is good to see you too. Valerie, you have grown quite a bit since the 11th grade." Miles above them, hovering at the very edge of the stratosphere, a cloaked United Nations high-altitude surveillance drone was recording every second of the encounter. Deep within the Cheyenne Mountain complex, the command center of the UN Global Defense Initiative was a hive of controlled chaos. Red emergency lighting bathed the frantic technicians as they desperately tried to reroute their blinded surveillance networks. General Vance, a man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthless pragmatism, stood at the center of the command floor. He was currently the highest-ranking military officer left with functional command over the surviving nuclear arsenal. "General, we have a visual," a junior analyst shouted, her voice cutting through the din of the bunker. "Optical feed from drone Delta 9er. It survived the EMP blast. We have eyes on a Kalen dropship." "Where?" Vance barked, marching toward the primary holographic display. "Washington, New York." "Show me the target zone." "That is the thing, sir. It is not a city. It is a farm in Iowa." The main screen flickered to life, displaying a high-resolution top-down view of Arthur's property. The room fell deathly silent as the gathered military leaders watched the towering alien commander drop to her knees and embrace an old man holding a glass of liquor. Vance stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the image. The supreme commander of an invading alien force, a being who possessed the firepower to turn continents to glass, was hugging a civilian. "Who is that man?" Vance demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Running facial recognition now, sir," the analyst replied, her fingers flying across her terminal. "Arthur Pendleton, 72, no military record, no intelligence ties. He is a retired high school history teacher." "A teacher," Vance repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Paranoia, sharp and venomous, began to flood his thoughts. This could not be a coincidence. Alien empires did not halt global invasions to visit retired educators in the middle of nowhere. Pendleton had to be a sleeper agent, He had to be a point of contact for a larger, more insidious infiltration network. Or worse, this was a targeted extraction of a key asset before the orbital bombardment began. "Sir, the alien commander is highly vulnerable right now," a tactical officer pointed out, gesturing to the screen. "She is separated from her main force. If we strike now, we could decapitate the enemy leadership before they deploy their ground forces." Vance narrowed his eyes, calculating the risks. The United Nations Peace Council was currently scrambling to draft a surrender broadcast, begging the Kalan Armada for mercy. Vance had no intention of surrendering. He saw an opportunity, a tiny fracture in the overwhelming armor of the enemy. If he captured the Supreme Commander, humanity would have a hostage. They would have leverage. But what was the true connection between the conqueror of worlds and a man who spent his life teaching American history? General the tactical officer pressed. "We have a Black Ops strike team stationed at a black site 50 miles from that location. We can have them on the ground in 10 minutes. Vance did not consult the council. He did not ask for authorization. He looked at the old man on the screen, feeling a deep, irrational hatred for the calm demeanor Arthur displayed in the face of annihilation. "Send the strike team," Vance ordered. "Capture the alien, and bring me the old man alive. I want to know exactly what kind of game he is playing." 20 years ago, the most dangerous weapon in the Kalan Empire sat in the third row of a high school history class, furiously taking notes on the French Revolution. Arthur gently patted the massive, armored shoulder pressing into his collarbone, feeling the thrum of exotic energy cores vibrating beneath the metallic plating. He gave her a firm, affectionate squeeze before pushing her back just enough to look at her face. The terrifying visage of the Supreme Commander softened. The glowing violet optics of her synthetic eyes shifted, dimming to a hue that almost resembled the awkward, intensely serious exchange student he remembered. Back then, she had called herself Valerie. She had been assigned to Earth as an infiltration scout, surgically altered and chemically suppressed to appear as a pale, remarkably tall human teenager. Her mission was to assimilate, observe, and catalog the psychological vulnerabilities of the human species ahead of a future invasion. She was expected to find a planet ripe for the slaughter, populated by disorganized, emotional creatures incapable of unified defense. Instead, she found a species that confused her. She found teenagers who cried over fictional characters in movies, communities that rallied to rebuild homes after devastating storms, and, most perplexingly, a history teacher who noticed she always ate her lunch alone under the bleachers. "Valerie," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the colossal ships blotting out the sun above them. "Your posture is still terrible, and you are crushing my ribs." Vael immediately retracted her arms, stepping back with a heavy thud that cracked the wooden floorboards of the porch. Her biomechanical suit recalibrated, the defensive spikes retracting slightly. "Apologies, Mr. Pendleton. My current biometric augmentation makes tactile interaction difficult to modulate. I did not intend to cause you physical distress." Arthur smiled, gesturing to the empty rocking chair next to him. It was absurdly small for a 7-foot alien warlord, but the gesture was genuine. "You never did. Though you did give the school principal quite a scare when you dismantled his car engine to show him how inefficient internal combustion was. I had to talk him out of calling the authorities." Vael looked at the rocking chair, then back to Arthur. A soft, mechanical sigh escaped her vocalizer. "You knew I was not from Eastern Europe. Valerie, you brought a lunchbox filled with highly enriched uranium isotopes to a field trip at the Science Museum. I had my suspicions." Arthur took another sip of his scotch, his eyes drifting up to the blackened sky. "I assume you are not here to retake your final exam. That fleet up there looks like it means business." The warmth of the reunion abruptly faded, replaced by the crushing weight of Vile's reality. She stood rigid, a conqueror returning to the site of her only vulnerability. They do. We are here for the harvest. Arthur lowered his glass. Harvest. That is a very sanitized word for what I imagine is a very messy process. It is a necessity of survival, Vile stated, her tone shifting back to the cold, authoritative cadence of a supreme commander. She paced the length of the ruined yard, her heavy boots crushing the charred remains of Arthur's corn. For 10,000 years, the Kalan Empire has expanded across the galactic arm. We achieved perfect unity by engineering our genetic code. We surgically removed the neural pathways responsible for erratic emotions. Fear, greed, anger, and empathy. We became perfectly logical. We eliminated war among our own kind. But you eliminated the spark, Arthur observed quietly, setting his glass on the small table beside him. Vile stopped, turning her violet gaze toward him. We eliminated our ability to adapt. Without emotional stimuli, our biological evolution stagnated. Our DNA is degrading, unraveling at the cellular level. Our immune systems are failing. The Kalan race is dying from perfect, flawless stagnation. She pointed a heavy, gauntleted finger at the ground. Earth is chaotic. Your biosphere is a violent, churning cauldron of genetic mutation and emotional resonance. Your species thrives on the very unpredictability we purged. We have come to extract that biological chaos. The Armada will strip mine the genetic material of this planet to synthesize a cure for our degradation. Arthur absorbed the sheer scale of the horror she was describing. He looked at the girl he had once taught about the Renaissance, about the capacity for human compassion and artistic brilliance. You came to butcher my entire world. Valerie, I gave you a B+ in ethics. I feel like I should retroactively lower that grade. I am trying to save you, Vile replied, the synthetic edge of her voice betraying a hint of desperation. I enacted a temporary localized override of the invasion protocols. It is a highly unorthodox command structure challenge. It bought me exactly 42 of your Earth minutes to come down here. I have secured a stasis pod on my personal dreadnought. You will be spared. You are the only human who showed me what it meant to care without expecting a tactical advantage in return. While Vile pleaded with her former teacher in the quiet dust of the farm, a very different kind of desperation was unfolding in the subterranean depths of the UN Global Defense Initiative. General Vance paced the command floor like a caged predator. He had muted the main communication channels, cutting off the frantic, cowardly pleas of the UN Peace Council. The diplomats were already drafting a surrender, offering up resources, land, and sovereignty to appease the dark gods hovering in the atmosphere. Vance despised them. Peace was a luxury for those who had not seen the true face of the enemy. Status on Echo Team, Vance demanded, his voice a low, commanding growl. They are flying under the radar ceiling, sir, the tactical officer reported, sweat beading on his forehead. 3 heavily modified stealth Blackhawks. They will be at the target location in less than 4 minutes. Weapons are hot. EMP payload is primed. Vance stared at the high-resolution satellite feed of the farmhouse. He watched the towering alien pacing in the yard, engaged in what looked like a civilized conversation with the retired teacher. It made his blood boil. Arthur Pendleton was not a victim. He was a collaborator. He was a traitor who had somehow brokered a private audience with the architect of humanity's destruction. Listen to me closely. Vance addressed the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his loyal technicians. The politicians in Geneva want to roll over and die. They think we can negotiate with a force that just shut off our entire global defense grid with a flick of a switch. We cannot, but we have a tactical advantage they do not see. He pointed sharply at the screen. The enemy commander is on the ground. She is isolated from her fleet. If Echo Team can neutralize her armor and extract her, we cut the head off the snake. We force the Armada into a standoff. We will hold their leader hostage and dictate the terms of our own survival. Sir, the junior analyst interjected, her voice trembling slightly. If we attack the Supreme Commander, the fleet might initiate an automatic retaliatory strike. They could level a continent before we even get her in a cell. They are going to level us anyway, Vance snapped coldly. This is our only play. Tell Echo Team they have a green light to use lethal force on the alien's escort if necessary. As for the old man, Vance's eyes narrowed into slits. He is a Priority 1 hostile asset. Detain him. If he resists, eliminate him. I will not let a treasonous civilian stand in the way of human survival. The red lights of the bunker pulsed, casting long, bloody shadows across the command floor. Vance had made his move, pushing all his chips into the center of the table. He was entirely blind to the sheer magnitude of the technological gap he was attempting to cross. Back on the porch, the heavy air was shattered by a low, rhythmic thumping sound echoing over the distant tree line. It was not the hum of alien engines, but the distinct, mechanical chop of military-grade rotary blades. Vile's helmet instantly snapped shut over her face, the interlocking metal scales sealing with a sharp hiss. The violet optics flared brightly as her suit's internal sensors processed the incoming threat. Rotary wing aircraft approaching at high velocity. Thermal signatures indicate heavy armaments. They are targeting this exact coordinate. Arthur sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He did not need a biomechanical suit to know what was happening. He knew the nature of scared men with big guns. It seems my government has decided to intervene. They probably do not understand why you are standing in a cornfield instead of blowing up the White House. They are attempting an ambush, Vile said, her voice now a booming, synthesized, commanding tone. The heavy shock troops standing by the dropship instantly raised their plasma rifles, the weapons whining as they charged to lethal capacity. A foolish tactical error. My guards will vaporize them before they enter effective firing range. No, Arthur said sharply, standing up from his rocking chair. His bad knee popped, but he ignored the pain, stepping directly between the towering alien warlord and the approaching sound of the helicopters. No vaporizing? Those are young men and women in those choppers. Valerie, they are terrified, and they are following orders from someone who is even more terrified. Vale stared down at him. They intend to kill us. Mr. Pendleton, my primary objective is your preservation. Then preserve them too, Arthur demanded, using the exact same tone he used when breaking up a fight in the school cafeteria. It was a tone that brooked absolutely no argument. You have technology that makes our weapons look like stone tools. Be smarter than them. Do not let them force you into a massacre. The sound of the helicopters grew deafening. 3 matte black shapes crested the tree line, banking aggressively toward the farm. The side doors were open, revealing heavily armed operatives aiming high-caliber sniper rifles and rocket launchers directly at the porch. Vaya looked at the incoming threat, then down at the fragile, stubborn old man standing in front of her. Her internal chronometer flashed a bright, warning crimson. The 42 minutes she had bought through her command challenge were rapidly ticking away. High above, in the cold vacuum of orbit, her second-in-command was already analyzing the override codes, preparing to seize control of the Armada and begin the harvest without her. Time was running out for both of them. The air tore apart as the lead helicopter fired a barrage of anti-armor missiles directly at the farmhouse. But the warheads never even scratched the paint on the porch. Supreme Commander Vielle did not flinch, nor did she raise a weapon. She simply tapped a glowing glyph on her armored wrist, Instantly, a shimmering geometric dome of hard light materialized over the yard. The missiles slammed into the barrier and froze entirely, suspended in midair by a localized temporal displacement field. The kinetic energy of the explosive payloads was instantly neutralized, leaving the deadly projectiles hanging harmlessly above the petunias like grotesque lawn ornaments. "A banter," Vielle said, her voice echoing with synthetic authority. "Initiate suppression protocol. Non-lethal. Ground those primitive aircraft." A voice responded from the dropship resting in the ruined cornfield. It was impeccably polite, remarkably dry, and carried the distinct haughty cadence of an aristocrat forced to perform menial labor. "As you command, Supreme Commander, though I must formally register my disappointment. A standard plasma volley would be significantly more efficient and far more entertaining." "Just do it. Banter," Vielle commanded. "Generating gravimetric tethers." The AI sighed. Invisible waves of heavy gravity pulsed from the dropship's external emitters. The 3 Black Hawk helicopters, roaring with mechanical fury just moments ago, suddenly dropped. It was not a violent crash. The aircraft were simply forced downward by an irresistible, invisible weight, pressing their landing skids deep into the soft topsoil of the farm. The rotors whined in protest, struggling against a force that made the air itself feel like thick molasses. The engines choked and sputtered, finally shutting down completely as the gravitational pressure triggered their emergency failsafes. The elite strike team inside was pinned to their seats, entirely immobilized and profoundly confused. Arthur adjusted his spectacles, looking at the suspended missiles and the grounded helicopters. "Valerie, your car alarm is incredibly impressive." "We must depart immediately," Vielle said, turning toward the massive, steaming wedge of black metal in the field. She offered a heavily armored hand to her former teacher. "My command override will expire shortly. If we remain on the surface, the Armada's automated targeting systems will vaporize this entire grid coordinate." Arthur took her massive hand, feeling the surprising gentleness of her grip. He abandoned his porch, his rocking chair, and his half-empty glass of scotch, walking briskly beside the towering warlord toward the belly of the alien craft. The interior of the Kalan dropship was a cathedral of brutalist efficiency. There were no soft edges, no warm lights, and absolutely no aesthetic comforts. The walls were lined with pulsing conduits of violet energy, and the floor was a metallic grate that thrummed with immense, barely contained power. Heavy shock troops flanked the entrance, their featureless helmets turning in unison to observe the fragile humans stepping onto their vessel. They did not attack, bound strictly by Vale's direct command parameters. Vielle guided Arthur to the cockpit, a raised platform dominated by holographic displays and a complex array of sensory interfaces. She gestured to the co-pilot station. Arthur sat down. The chair was constructed of rigid, overlapping plates of dark metal, designed for a species that wore heavy biomechanical armor and lacked basic emotional requirements like comfort. Sharp angles dug directly into his spine. "Valerie," Arthur said, shifting awkwardly and wincing as a metal node prodded his lower back. "You have conquered the galaxy, mastered faster-than-light travel, and defeated gravity. Yet, your entire species has somehow failed to invent a decent lumbar cushion. Does your empire hate lower back support? Our physiology does not register physical fatigue in the same manner yours does," Vielle replied, taking the pilot's seat. Her armor seamlessly interfaced with the ship, glowing tendrils of light snapping into the ports on her spine. "Banter, secure the passenger and initiate atmospheric exit." "Securing the organic liability," the AI responded. A web of hard light restraints materialized across Arthur's chest, pinning him firmly to the agonizingly stiff chair. He let out a breathless grunt as the ship launched. There was no countdown, no roaring combustion, and no shaking cabin. 1 second they were in the cornfield, and the next, a sheer vertical force pinned Arthur deep into the metal seat. The blue sky outside the viewport instantly dissolved into the black, star-studded canvas of the void. Arthur gasped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked out the viewing port, watching the curvature of the earth fall away in a breathtaking arc of blue and white. He was a history teacher who had barely traveled outside the American Midwest, and now he was leaving the atmosphere in an alien warship. The sheer majesty of the sight temporarily erased the pain in his back. "Approaching the flagship, Commander," Banter announced, breaking the silence. "However, I am detecting a highly irregular command signature radiating from the central bridge. My access to the primary docking bays has been rescinded." Vile's glowing violet optics narrowed. Her hands flew across the holographic interface, attempting to force a connection. "Override the lockout. Banter. Use my personal command cipher." "I have already attempted that," the AI replied, sounding distinctly perturbed. "Your cipher has been purged from the active registry. It appears you have been officially relieved of duty. Commander." Before Vile could respond, the central holographic projector in the cockpit flared to life. The image of a Kalan warrior materialized. He was taller than Vile, his armor jagged and scarred from centuries of frontline combat. His face lacked the smooth, symmetrical grace of Vile's. It was harsh, angular, and devoid of even the slightest hint of warmth. This was Kael'Zor, the second in command of the Armada, a general who viewed biological life as an infection waiting to be cured. "Supreme Commander Vile," Kael'Zor said, his voice a grinding metallic rasp that vibrated through the hull of the dropship. "Or should I refer to you by your designated scout title? Your localized command override was a temporary nuisance. It has been rectified." "Kael'Zor," Vale stated coldly, her posture rigid. "You are committing treason against the Kalan Empire. Power down the weapons arrays immediately." "I am saving the Empire from your weakness," Kael'Zor countered. The hologram flickered slightly as he stepped closer to the transmission array. "Your time among these chaotic, emotional creatures infected you. I reviewed your behavioral logs. You halted a planetary harvest to embrace a frail, dying organic. You possess empathy. It is a rot, Vile, a genetic rot that will accelerate the degradation of our species. I am excising that rot." Arthur listened closely, his historian's mind working rapidly. He recognized the pattern. This was not just a military coup. It was a violent ideological purge, the classic usurpation of power masked as righteous salvation. "You do not possess the authority to initiate the harvest without the High Council's blessing," Vile warned, her hands resting firmly on the weapon controls of her dropship. "I possess the fleet," Kael'Zor replied smoothly, "and I possess allies on the surface who are surprisingly eager to facilitate their own destruction." The hologram shifted, splitting the projection into 2 screens. On the second screen, the feed from the United Nations subterranean bunker appeared. General Vance stood in the center of the command floor, his face bathed in the red emergency lighting, looking directly into the alien camera feed. Arthur's eyes widened. Earth's military leadership was communicating directly with the mutinous alien general. "General Vance of Earth," Kael'Zor stated, gesturing to the human officer, a creature of commendable logic, despite his biological limitations. He understands the necessity of sacrifice. Vance glared at the screen, completely unapologetic. "My mandate is the survival of the human race. You presented terms. I accepted them." "What terms?" Arthur demanded, leaning forward against his hard light restraints. "General, what have you done?" Vance scoffed, recognizing the old man from the drone footage. "I secured a future Pendleton." The Kalan Empire requires biological material. Kael'Zor offered a localized harvest. We surrender our major population centers, and in exchange, he spares the designated secure zones. Humanity survives, culled but intact. It is a simple calculation of acceptable losses. Arthur felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It was the oldest, most venomous lie in human history. The promise of safety for the few, bought with the blood of the many. Vance truly believed he could outsmart a technologically superior force by throwing billions of innocent people to the wolves. He is playing you, General, Arthur said, his voice steady and cutting. He does not respect your borders or your secure zones. He is using you to keep Earth's nuclear arsenal powered down while he removes his only political rival. The moment Vial is dead, he will break his word and glass the entire planet. Vance sneered. I am not taking strategic advice from a high school teacher. Echo Team failed, but you are isolated in orbit. You have no fleet. Vial, surrender. Kael'Zor cut the human feed, returning the hologram to his own imposing visage. The human speaks the truth. Vial, once you are eliminated, I will cleanse this world entirely. The biological material will be extracted from the ashes. Automated targeting systems are currently locking onto Earth's primary capitals. The harvest begins in 1 standard hour. The hologram blinked out of existence, leaving the cockpit bathed in the cold, violet glow of the ship's instruments. A blaring alarm suddenly shrieked through the cabin. Commander, Banter announced, the AI's voice dropping its sarcastic tone for a moment of genuine urgency. The flagship has designated our vessel as a hostile target. Primary plasma batteries are charging. We are locked out of the main hangar bays. We have approximately 40 seconds before we are reduced to atomic vapor. Vial did not panic. Her hands danced across the manual flight controls, ripping the ship out of its steady holding pattern and sending it into a violently evasive corkscrew maneuver. The G-forces slammed Arthur back against the metal spikes of his chair, stealing the breath from his lungs. Banter, plot a course for the ship's equatorial exhaust trench, Vial ordered, her eyes locked on the colossal floating city of black metal looming ahead of them. The exhaust trench is highly irradiated and lacks a pressurized docking seal, Banter pointed out unhelpfully. It is also blind to the primary defense turrets, Vial replied, pushing the throttle to maximum. We are going in through the back door. Arthur gritted his teeth, watching a massive volley of searing green plasma streak past the viewport, missing the dropship by mere meters. They were entirely outgunned, locked out of their own army, and humanity's only defense force was actively conspiring with the enemy. The odds of survival were mathematically insignificant. Surviving the firing squad of a Kalan dreadnought required more than evasive maneuvers. It required flying directly into the radioactive belly of the beast. The equatorial exhaust trench of the flagship was a churning river of expelled heat and toxic plasma, and Vial plunged her dropship right down its throat. The heat alarms inside the cockpit blared a continuous, terrifying warning as the hull temperature spiked to catastrophic levels. Arthur gripped the edges of his excruciatingly rigid seat, his knuckles turning white as the vessel violently vibrated against the immense thermal pressure. Outside the viewport, the universe was entirely replaced by a blinding curtain of neon green exhaust. Banter, Vial commanded, her hands a blur across the manual thruster controls. Divert all auxiliary power to the frontal deflector shields. Calculate the precise interval of the thermal venting cycle. Calculating, the AI replied, sounding profoundly unimpressed by their impending incineration. You have a window of exactly 3.4 seconds before the primary thrusters ignite and melt us into a rather unappealing puddle of slag. I highly recommend not missing it. Vial did not miss it. She slammed the maneuvering thrusters hard to starboard, forcing the dropship through a narrow, unshielded maintenance iris just as a tidal wave of superheated plasma flooded the trench behind them. The dropship crashed violently onto the grated deck of a cavernous, pitch-black recycling bay. The engines choked and died, leaving them in absolute darkness. Save for the emergency lighting casting long, jagged shadows across the alien architecture. Arthur unbuckled his hard light restraints, gasping for breath as the crushing gravity of the evasive maneuvers finally lifted. Every muscle in his body ached, but he was alive. "We are inside the perimeter," Vial stated, her biomechanical armor hissing as it recalibrated to the internal atmospheric pressure of the dreadnought. "Kael'Zor's internal sensors will not scan this sector. The radiation shielding masking the recycling bays works in our favor. Stay close to me, Mr. Pendleton." They stepped out of the cooling dropship and into the abyssal belly of the Kaelan flagship. The scale of the place was incomprehensible. A labyrinth of massive thrumming conduits and catwalks suspended over bottomless shafts of grinding machinery. It was a cold, merciless environment, a perfect reflection of the empire that built it. As they moved deeper into the shadows of the maintenance sector, a figure detached itself from the gloom above. Before Vial could raise her armaments, the figure dropped onto the catwalk directly in their path, a heavy plasma cutter leveled squarely at Vial's chest. The assailant wore Kaelan engineering armor, heavily modified and scarred by recent plasma burns. The pristine, intimidating aesthetic of the shock troops was entirely absent, replaced by the desperate, cobbled-together gear of a fugitive. Vale froze, her violet optics locking onto the intruder. She did not raise her weapons. Instead, a profound shudder ran through her towering frame. "Sirach!" The engineer lowered the weapon. He pulled back his heavily dented helmet, revealing a face that mirrored Vial's pale, iridescent features, though his eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic. He took a hesitant step forward, tossing the heavy tool aside. Vial closed the distance between them in a single stride. The supreme commander of the Kaelan Armada, a warlord capable of glassing continents, threw her arms around the lowly engineer. It was a collision of metal and desperate relief, a fiercely passionate embrace that completely shattered the illusion of an emotionless alien race. Sirach buried his face against her armored neck, his hands gripping her shoulder plating as if she were the only solid object in a collapsing universe. "I thought Kael'Zor's execution squads had found you," Vial whispered, the synthetic edge of her vocalizer failing to hide the raw, undisguised affection in her voice. "They tried," Sirach replied, his voice rough and breathless. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. "I have been crawling through the ventilation shafts for 3 planetary rotations. When I saw a rogue dropship breach the exhaust trench, I knew it had to be you. No one else possesses that exact combination of tactical brilliance and absolute recklessness." Arthur stood quietly to the side, leaning against a railing. He observed the reunion with the keen, analytical eye of a man who had spent decades studying the human condition. He looked at Vial and Sirach, 2 beings from a civilization that claimed to have genetically eradicated all traces of empathy, love, and fear. The history teacher realized the grand lie of the Kaelan Empire. Their lack of emotion was not an evolutionary endpoint. It was not a biological mandate woven into their DNA. It was a manufactured political tool. The Kaelan leadership had not bred out empathy. They had simply criminalized it, suppressing it through generations of extreme conditioning and rigid societal control. The capacity to feel, to love, to fear for another person's safety was still there, buried deep beneath the cold, metallic surface. Sirach and Vale were living proof that the spark of their humanity, or whatever the Kaelan equivalent was, had never truly been extinguished. It had only been waiting for permission to ignite. "Vile," Sirach said, stepping back and acknowledging Arthur with a brief, confused glance. Kael'Zor has locked down the central bridge. He has complete control of the neural comm core and the primary weapon arrays. He is preparing to initiate the planetary harvest protocols. We have thousands of automated sentries and elite guard units between us and the command deck. Then we push through them, Vial commanded, her authoritative posture returning. We utilize overwhelming force to breach the forward corridors. Valerie, wait, Arthur interrupted, pushing himself off the railing. He stepped into the dim light between the two towering aliens. Overwhelming force is exactly what Kael'Zor expects you to use. He has an army. You have an engineer, a sarcastic computer program, and a retired man with bad knees. If you fight him on his terms, we will lose. Vial frowned, her violet eyes narrowing. What alternative do you propose, Mr. Pendleton? The Kaelan military doctrine dictates direct, efficient confrontation. Then it is time to throw out the textbook, Arthur said, the familiar commanding cadence of the classroom returning to his voice. Throughout Earth's history, inferior forces have successfully toppled massive empires not by matching their strength, but by exploiting their rigidity. When the Persian Empire marched on Greece, a fraction of their numbers held them off by forcing them into a geographical choke point at Thermopylae. When the American revolutionaries fought the British Empire, they abandoned the traditional lines of battle and vanished into the trees, striking supply lines and communications. He pointed down the dark, labyrinthine corridor of the maintenance sector. This ship is a machine. It relies on perfect order and uninterrupted communication. We are not going to march up to the bridge and challenge him to a duel. We are going to introduce chaos. Sirach tilted his head, intrigued by the frail organic creature. You propose asymmetric sabotage. We do not possess the schematics to effectively disable the primary systems without triggering the internal security grid. You are an engineer. Sirach, Arthur countered, pointing at the heavy plasma cutter resting on the deck. You do not need to disable the systems, and you just need to break the right pipes. Banter. Are you currently monitoring the ship's internal security feed? I am tethered to the Supreme Commander's armor, attempting to remain entirely inconspicuous. The AI replied, which is quite difficult when one is plotting grand treason in a recycling bay. Good, Arthur said, a sly smile crossing his weathered face. Find us the environmental control junctions and the automated troop deployment lifts. Sirach, you are going to rupture the coolant lines and flood the lower decks with heavy vapor to blind their optics. Valerie, you are going to systematically destroy the localized communication relays in every sector we pass through. We will blind Kael'Zor, deafen his commanders, and force his troops to hunt us in the dark. Vial looked at Arthur, a profound sense of respect illuminating her alien features. She had brought him along to save his life, but he was actively writing the survival strategy for an entire planet. We turn his own dreadnought into a trap. Vial summarized, the tactical brilliance of the plan locking into her mind. She reached down and retrieved Sirach's plasma cutter, handing it back to the engineer. Let us teach Kael'Zor the value of unpredictability. They moved swiftly out of the recycling bay, armed with a desperate plan and the heavy burden of a ticking clock. High above them, on the locked bridge of the flagship, Kael'Zor was already finalizing the planetary targeting sequence, unaware that the fatal flaw of his perfect logical empire had just breached his lower decks. On the surface of Earth, General Vance sat in his red-lit bunker, arrogantly waiting for a promised salvation that was never going to come. Time was collapsing inward, drawing all of them toward a singular catastrophic ignition point. Sabotaging a city-sized alien dreadnought was surprisingly similar to managing a chaotic high school hallway during a fire drill. It merely required absolute confidence, a swift stride, and a blatant disregard for anyone else's authority. Under Arthur's impromptu tactical direction, the trio moved through the labyrinthine maintenance decks like a localized natural disaster. Cyrock utilized his heavy plasma cutter to shear through primary coolant arteries, flooding the metallic corridors with a dense, freezing white vapor that instantly blinded the ship's internal optical sensors. Vile moved silently through the fog, a towering phantom of biomechanical destruction, methodically crushing communication relays with her gauntlets. By the time the central bridge realized a sector was malfunctioning, the three of them were already 2 decks higher, leaving nothing but silent alarms and confused sensor ghosts in their wake. They reached the grand concourse leading to the primary command elevators, a cavernous hall constructed of polished black metal and illuminated by harsh, violet light. But Kael'Zor was not a fool. The sabotage had drawn attention, and a heavy squad of Kaelan elite guards had deployed to lock down the sector. There were 6 of them, clad in the same terrifying spiked armor as Vile, their heavy plasma rifles already sweeping the fog for targets. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, lacking any hesitation or fear. They were biological machines executing a search and destroy protocol. Vile tensed, her own internal weapon systems whining as they charged. Cyrock, stay behind me. I will draw their fire and attempt to break their line. It will be violent. Excuse me, Arthur whispered, placing a gentle hand on her massive armored forearm. Allow me. Before the Supreme Commander could protest, the retired 72-year-old history teacher stepped directly out of the vapor and into the harsh violet light of the concourse. He stood perfectly straight, adjusted his spectacles, and clasped his hands behind his back. The Kaelan guards instantly snapped their rifles toward him, the targeting lasers painting his chest with 6 lethal red dots. Arthur did not flinch. He channeled every ounce of the stern, unyielding authority he had honed over 4 decades of dealing with unruly adolescents. He drew a deep breath and projected his voice so it echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Gentlemen, what exactly do you think you are doing running in these halls with charged weapons? The Kaelan guards froze. Their rigid, emotionless programming relied on a strict categorization of threats. A human was an organic liability, meant to cower, flee, or attack in a panic. This human was doing none of those things. He was standing completely exposed, radiating an inexplicable aura of total superiority, and demanding an explanation for their behavior. It was a massive, paralyzing cognitive dissonance. Their threat assessment algorithm stalled, trying to process the logic of the situation. Put those down immediately before someone gets hurt, Arthur scolded, pointing a sharp, accusatory finger at the lead guard. I am profoundly disappointed in this lack of discipline. Is this the standard of behavior Kael'Zor teaches you? Because it is entirely unacceptable. The lead guard lowered his rifle a fraction of an inch, his biomechanical helmet tilting in sheer, processing confusion. Identify yourself. You are not authorized to issue disciplinary parameters. I am the one asking the questions, Arthur interrupted, his voice cracking like a whip. Now, stand down and wait for your detention slips. The momentary hesitation was all the tactical advantage the Supreme Commander needed. Vile exploded from the vapor like a missile. The contrast was absurd and beautifully lethal. While Arthur stood with his hands on his hips, shaking his head in manufactured disappointment, Vile moved with terrifying, fluid grace. She did not use her blasters. She closed the distance in a single bound, using the guard's own rigid posture against them. She swept the legs out from under the first 2, her heavy gauntlets striking their armor's neural lock pressure points. They collapsed into unconscious heaps of heavy metal. Cyrock followed right behind her, using his plasma cutter to melt the power cells of the remaining guards' rifles before they could even re-aim. Vile grabbed the final standing guard by the breastplate, hoisted him effortlessly into the air, and slammed him against the polished black wall, short-circuiting his suit's dampeners and rendering him instantly comatose. The entire engagement lasted less than 6 seconds. Arthur calmly stepped over a twitching, unconscious alien soldier. "Tardy," he muttered, adjusting his cardigan. Vile looked at the fallen squad, then down at her former teacher. A sound remarkably similar to a laugh escaped her synthetic vocalizer. "Mr. Pendleton, your methodology is highly unorthodox but undeniably effective. Bullies are the same everywhere, Valerie," Arthur replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "They rely on you playing by their rules. Once you refuse, they do not know what to do." "I am afraid Kael'Zor will not be so easily confused," Banter interjected, the AI's voice crackling through Vale's external speakers. "And we have a significantly more pressing issue unfolding on the planetary surface. General Vance has just realized he has been betrayed." Deep within the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, the red emergency lighting had taken on the sickening hue of absolute doom. General Vance stood before the primary holographic display, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. The global map before him was rapidly updating, and the data was catastrophic. Kael'Zor had lied. The secure zones were not being spared. The alien dreadnoughts hovering over North America, Europe, and Asia were not powering down their weapons. They were charging massive, terraforming energy spikes. The localized harvest was a myth. The entire planet was being prepped for biological extraction, beginning with the simultaneous vaporization of every major human population center. "He played us," the junior analyst whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the shifting red targets on her monitor. "The ceasefire was just to keep our grid down while they locked in their coordinates. They are going to wipe us out." Vance's ambition shattered, replaced by a cold, venomous fury. He had gambled the survival of the human race on the word of a machine-like conqueror, and he had lost. But Vance was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. If humanity was going to burn, he was going to ensure the Kaelan Armada burned with them. "Initiate the Archangel Protocol," Vance ordered, his voice remarkably calm despite the apocalypse unfolding around him. The tactical officer whipped around, his eyes wide with horror. "Sir, the Archangel Protocol. That unlocks the strategic nuclear reserves. If we launch everything we have at the flagship, their automated retaliatory systems will detect the launch. They will not just harvest the planet, they will crack the crust open. It is a guaranteed extinction event." "We are already extinct," Vance growled, stepping up to the command console and inserting his executive launch key. "I will not let them butcher us like cattle. Turn the keys. Launch everything." Igniting the last fires of a dying world, silos across the American Midwest, hidden submarines deep in the Pacific, and mobile launchers crawling through the Siberian snow all activated simultaneously. Hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles tore out of their silos, a desperate, apocalyptic swarm screaming upward into the blackened sky, all aimed directly at the Kaelan flagship. Aboard the dreadnought, the blaring klaxons of the ship's internal security were suddenly drowned out by a deafening system-wide threat alarm. The deck beneath Arthur's feet shuddered violently. Commander," Banter's voice dropped all traces of its usual sarcasm. "Earth has just launched a massive nuclear strike against our hull. The payload is primitive, but the sheer volume will breach our secondary kinetic shielding." "Can the hull withstand it?" Vile demanded, breaking into a heavy run toward the command elevators, waving Arthur and Cyrock to follow. "The hull will survive," Banter replied rapidly. "But the dreadnought's automated retaliatory protocol has engaged. The ship detects a planetary-level threat. It is currently overriding Kael'Zor's harvest sequence and charging the primary tectonic disruptors. In exactly 4 minutes, this ship will fire a beam directly into Earth's fault lines. The planet will be physically torn apart. Arthur felt his blood run cold. Vance's desperate pride had just accelerated the timeline from subjugation to total annihilation. We have to stop those disruptors. Banter. How do we shut them down? The retaliatory protocol is hardwired into the central command matrix, the AI explained. The only way to abort the firing sequence is to manually access the neural comm core on the bridge and initiate a system-wide emotional override. A paradoxical command that contradicts the ship's purely logical defense parameters. We need to reach the bridge, Vielle roared, her heavy boots denting the floor plating as she sprinted. They reached the grand elevators just as the heavy, reinforced blast doors began to slide shut, triggered by the Dreadnought's lockdown protocols. Cyrock threw himself forward, wedging his heavily armored shoulder between the closing doors. The immense pneumatic pressure groaned, grinding against the engineer's armor as he desperately fought to keep the gap open for Vielle and Arthur. But Kael'Zor's elite guard had not given up the chase. A fresh squad poured into the concourse behind them, their weapons already charged. "Go!" Cyrock screamed, his face contorted in agony as the doors threatened to crush him. Vielle shoved Arthur through the gap, turning to grab Cyrock and pull him inside. But as the engineer slipped through, a searing volley of green plasma erupted from the concourse. The heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing them inside the ascending elevator. But not before a devastating shot found its mark. Cyrock collapsed onto the grated floor, clutching his side. His modified armor had been completely breached. A sickening, glowing wound sizzled against his ribs, vital synthetic fluids and pale Kaelan blood pooling rapidly beneath him. Vielle dropped to her knees, her biomechanical helmet retracting. Her beautiful silver face was twisted in an expression that the Kaelan Empire claimed did not exist. It was raw, unfiltered, agonizing grief. She pressed her hands over the wound, desperately trying to stem the bleeding, but the plasma had burned too deep. "Cyrock," Vielle choked out, her voice trembling so violently the synthetic translator could barely render the words. "You stay with me. Do not close your eyes." The engineer offered a weak, blood-stained smile, reaching up with a trembling hand to touch Vielle's cheek. "It seems I will not be able to help you fix the farm." "Vielle." Arthur knelt beside them, the heavy weight of the world pressing down on his frail shoulders. The elevator was rocketing upward toward the heart of the enemy armada. Earth was minutes away from shattering into 1 billion pieces. The nuclear swarm was closing in, and the one person Vielle loved was bleeding out on the floor. How could a history teacher and a grieving commander possibly break the unbreakable logic of a doomsday machine before the timer hit 0? A ticking clock is the oldest and most ruthless enemy in the universe. And right now, it was counting down to the extinction of the human race. The heavy elevator rushed upward, its internal dampeners straining against the sheer velocity of their ascent. Arthur stripped off his wool cardigan, pressing the bundled fabric hard against the glowing, cauterized edges of Cyrock's wound. The engineer gritted his teeth, his pale skin taking on a terrifying, translucent quality as his vital fluids continued to leak onto the grated floor. Vielle knelt beside them for only a fraction of a second longer. When she rose, the raw, unfiltered grief on her face vanished, entirely consumed by a cold, blinding rage that radiated from her towering frame like a physical heat. She did not draw her plasma blasters. She engaged the heavy kinetic drivers built into her gauntlets, the thick, spiked metal shifting and locking into a brutal configuration designed for close-quarters slaughter. The elevator decelerated with a bone-jarring thud. The thick blast doors hissed, parting to reveal the central bridge of the Kaelan flagship. It was a cathedral of warfare. The room was vast, tiered in descending circular platforms of polished black obsidian, all leading down to a colossal panoramic viewport that displayed the curvature of Earth. Holographic tactical displays floated in the air, tracking the incoming swarm of human nuclear missiles and the charging sequence of the dreadnought's own tectonic disruptors. At the very center of the lowest platform, standing before the primary neural comm core, was Kale Zor. He turned as the doors opened, his jagged armor gleaming in the harsh violet light. 24 elite guards flanked him, raising their weapons. But Kale Zor held up a single gauntleted hand. The guards lowered their rifles. You bring a dying traitor and a frail organic to the heart of the Armada. Kale Zor sneered, his metallic voice echoing across the cavernous bridge. Your descent into emotional madness is complete. Vile. The human missiles will break harmlessly against our kinetic shielding in exactly 2 minutes. In return, our automated disruptors will shatter their planet into dust. You are entirely too late. Vael did not speak. She stepped off the elevator and broke into a heavy sprint, the deck plating buckling beneath her boots. Kale Zor ignited a heavy energy blade attached to his right wrist, the weapon hissing as it sliced through the cold air. He braced himself, expecting a tactical, measured assault from his former commander. He expected her to utilize the environmental cover, to engage his guards, to fight like a Kalen. Vael fought like a creature possessed. She bypassed the guards completely, her thrusters flaring as she launched herself directly at the usurper. The collision was deafening. Vael slammed her shoulder into Kale Zor's chest, the kinetic impact sending a shockwave rippling across the bridge. Kale Zor was heavier, reinforced with thicker armor plating, but Vael had momentum and pure, unadulterated fury on her side. They crashed onto the command deck, a terrifying tangle of shifting metal, sparking wires, and brutal short-range strikes. Kale Zor drove his knee into Vael's abdomen, forcing her back, and swung his energy blade in a lethal arc aimed at her neck. Vael caught his wrist with her left hand, the metal of her gauntlet groaning under the immense pressure, while her right fist pistoned forward, burying itself in the center of his chest plate. Armor fractured. Sparks showered the pristine black floor. The 2 alien warlords engaged in a savage, lightning-fast melee, tearing the command consoles apart with their bare hands. Mr. Pendleton. Banter's voice crackled from a small metallic node Vael had discreetly dropped onto the floor near the elevator. The Supreme Commander is keeping the primary defense squad occupied. You must access the neural comm core immediately. It is the large, crystalline pillar located directly behind their current position. Arthur left Cyrock propped against the wall of the elevator. His legs ached, his lungs burned, and he was acutely aware that a stray plasma bolt would instantly vaporize him. But he was a teacher, and his student was fighting a war to save his home. He kept his head low, darting from the cover of one holographic projector to the next, navigating the perimeter of the chaotic brawl. The Kalen guards were entirely focused on the clash of their commanders, their rigid programming struggling to process the chaotic, uncalculated nature of Vael's assault. Arthur slipped past them, reaching the raised dais of the neural comm core. It was a towering pillar of shifting, liquid light, pulsing with the cold, violet rhythm of the ship's artificial intelligence. There were no keyboards, no buttons, and no recognizable interfaces. It was a machine designed to interface directly with the biological nervous system of a Kalen commander. Banter, Arthur whispered rapidly, staring at the sheer alien complexity of the machine. There is nothing to type on. How do I initiate the system override? You cannot type a paradox into a biological defense matrix, Banter replied from the comm node. A computer virus would be identified and purged in a microsecond. You must introduce a data stream so chaotic, so fundamentally contradictory to the Kalen baseline programming, that it forcefully crashes the targeting algorithms. You must upload pure, unfiltered human neuro-emotive data. You want me to upload my feelings into a doomsday machine? Arthur asked, a hysterical edge creeping into his voice. Precisely, Banter confirmed. Place your bare hands on the liquid interface. The core is designed to read and process synaptic patterns. Do not think of logic. Do not think of strategy. Think of everything the Kalan Empire surgically removed from themselves. Pour your humanity into the machine. Arthur looked at the countdown hovering in the air above the core. The human nuclear missiles were 45 seconds away from impact. The tectonic disruptors were whining, a deep bass vibration that shook the very fillings in Arthur's teeth. The planet below, his home, the farm, the graves of his parents, the classrooms where he had spent a lifetime, was about to be erased. He placed both hands firmly against the shifting violet surface of the pillar. The sensation was instantaneous and terrifying. It felt as though 1,000 icy needles had plunged directly into his brain, rapidly cataloging every memory, every thought, every fleeting emotion he possessed. The machine was cold, sterile, and perfectly efficient. It demanded data. Arthur closed his eyes. He stopped fighting the intrusion and opened the floodgates of his mind. He did not give the machine anger or fear. He knew Kael'Zor expected violence, and a defense matrix could easily categorize and dismiss aggressive intent. Instead, Arthur gave the machine the profound, messy, overwhelming beauty of the human experience. He thought of the Renaissance, of Michelangelo pulling magnificent life from unyielding stone. He thought of the roaring triumph of a Beethoven symphony, the chaotic soaring notes that defied mathematical perfection to achieve something far greater. He remembered the smell of rain on dry Iowa topsoil, the quiet, unspoken comfort of sitting on a porch as the seasons changed. He recalled the crushing, breathless grief of watching a loved one slip away, the profound vulnerability of a hospital room, and the incredible, irrational strength required to wake up the next day and continue living. The violet light of the pillar began to flicker. Arthur pushed harder, his breathing shallow, sweat beading on his forehead as he dug into his most personal memories. He thought of a young, isolated girl named Valerie sitting under the high school bleachers, analyzing her peers with cold, mechanical detachment. He remembered the exact moment he had chosen not to report her strange behavior, but to sit down beside her, offer her half a sandwich, and ask her what she thought about the French Revolution. He poured out the unconditional, fiercely protective care of a teacher who realizes his student is lost and decides to guide her home. He gave the doomsday machine empathy, raw, unfiltered, agonizingly beautiful empathy. The effect was cataclysmic. The liquid surface of the pillar violently shifted from cold violet to a blazing, incandescent amber. The neural comm core, designed to process pure logic, was suddenly overwhelmed by a tsunami of irrational, highly compressed emotional data. It could not categorize the concept of a symphony. It could not calculate the tactical advantage of grief. It completely failed to understand the arithmetic of unconditional love. The data stream erupted outward. The core synthesized Arthur's synaptic patterns and broadcast them directly into the dreadnought's internal network, blasting the emotional payload across every deck, every corridor, and every Kalan soldier instantly. The broadcast did not stop there. The flagship automatically relayed the data to the rest of the Armada hovering over Earth. Across the globe, thousands of Kalan shock troops, engineers, and commanders froze. Centuries of genetic suppression and psychological conditioning shattered under the sheer weight of Arthur's memories. The Kalan had not lost their capacity to feel. It had merely been locked away. Arthur's broadcast was the key turning violently in the lock. On the bridge, the 24 elite guards dropped their plasma rifles. The heavy weapons clattered uselessly against the obsidian floor. One guard fell to his knees, his armored hands clutching his helmet as he gasped for air, suddenly overwhelmed by the phantom sensation of rain on dry soil. Another stared down at his own hands, weeping openly, entirely unable to comprehend the profound sorrow of a hospital room he had never visited. The dreadnought's artificial intelligence, tasked with executing the retaliatory strike, encountered a fatal paradox. It was programmed to preserve Kaelan life by eliminating threats. But the data flooding its network suggested that the target below was the very source of the emotional vitality the Kaelan race needed to survive. To destroy Earth was to destroy the cure. The deep, vibrating hum of the tectonic disruptors abruptly stopped. The countdown clock hovering above the core vanished. The automated firing sequence was permanently aborted. Seconds later, Earth's desperate nuclear swarm struck the flagship. The primitive warheads detonated against the dreadnought's exterior kinetic shielding, blossoming into brilliant, harmless spheres of atomic fire against the dark canvas of space. The ship barely registered the impact. Kael'Zor stumbled backward, tearing himself away from Vial's grasp. The massive warlord clutched the sides of his head, his face contorted in absolute terror. The emotional broadcast had hit him the hardest. The sudden, violent influx of empathy forced his mind to retroactively process the billions of lives he had extinguished over centuries of conquest. The sheer, crushing weight of that manufactured sorrow drove him to his knees, his energy blade deactivating and retracting into his gauntlet. Vial stood over him, her armor battered and scarred, her chest heaving as she drew ragged breaths. She looked at the weeping guards, the kneeling usurper, and finally at the frail old man standing by the glowing amber pillar, his hands still pressed against the glass. Arthur pulled his hands away, swaying slightly as the intense synaptic connection severed. He wiped a drop of sweat from his brow, adjusting his spectacles as he looked out the massive viewport. Below them, the blue sphere of Earth remained perfectly intact, unaware of how close it had come to the abyss. The silence on the bridge was deafening, broken only by the sound of alien soldiers experiencing the terrifying, beautiful burden of a broken heart. An empire built on absolute, unyielding logic cannot survive the sudden, chaotic introduction of a guilty conscience. Kael'Zor learned this the hard way as he knelt weeping on the polished obsidian floor of his own conquered bridge. The usurper clutched his chest, gasping for air as centuries of suppressed atrocities flooded his newly awakened neural pathways. He was no longer a flawless conqueror. He was a broken machine drowning in the phantom echoes of the lives he had extinguished. Around him, the elite guards were in a similar state of profound psychological disarray. They looked at their weapons in sheer horror, dropping them as if the dark metal had suddenly turned white-hot against their palms. Vial did not execute her rival. The old Kaelan military doctrine would have demanded an immediate, lethal stroke to secure command. But the old doctrine was dead. She stood tall, her heavily dented armor groaning as she addressed the weeping soldiers. "Secure him," Vial commanded, her voice ringing out with a new resonant authority that owed nothing to synthetic translation and everything to genuine conviction. "Take Kael'Zor to the deepest confinement tier. He will stand trial not for treason against the state, but for crimes against life itself." Two guards, still trembling violently, stepped forward. They hauled the shattered general to his feet. Kael'Zor offered no resistance. His violet eyes were wide, fixated on the blue sphere of Earth outside the viewport, completely undone by the terrifying beauty of a world he had nearly murdered. Vial did not wait to watch them drag him away. She turned and sprinted back toward the heavy blast doors of the grand elevator. Arthur was already kneeling beside Cyrock. The engineer's breathing was terrifyingly shallow, his translucent skin taking on an ashen hue as the glowing wound in his side continued to pulse. Vial fell to her knees, sliding her massive armored arms beneath Cyrock and lifting him effortlessly against her breastplate. "Banter!" Vial shouted, her voice laced with an entirely un-Kaelan edge of panic. "Prepare the primary medical bay. I require emergency trauma stasis protocols immediately." Already prepped and waiting, "Commander," the AI replied, its usual dry sarcasm replaced by crisp, focused efficiency. "And might I add, it is strangely refreshing to hear genuine urgency in your vocal tone. It makes my processing cycles run significantly faster." They rushed through the chaotic corridors of the dreadnought. The ship was in an uproar, filled with confused, highly emotional soldiers trying to understand the sudden, brilliant spectrum of feelings cascading through their minds. Vial ignored them all. Her entire universe narrowed down to the failing heartbeat of the engineer in her arms. In the sterile, blindingly bright medical bay, automated surgical appendages descended from the ceiling. They sealed Cyrock inside a cylindrical stasis pod, bathing him in a restorative emerald gel that immediately neutralized the plasma burns and began regenerating his damaged cellular tissue. Vial placed a heavy, gauntleted hand against the transparent surface of the pod. Her optics tracked the steadying rhythm of his vital signs on the overhead monitor. Cyrock opened his eyes. They were heavy, clouded by the stasis gel, but they locked onto Vale with an intensity that defied the thick glass separating them. He raised a weak hand, pressing his palm against the inside of the pod, perfectly mirroring where her hand rested on the outside. Vale smiled. It was a small, fiercely protective expression. The romantic resolution was not sealed with a dramatic proclamation, but with the quiet, profound certainty that they no longer had to hide in the dark. They had fought the entire Kaelan Empire for the right to care for one another, and they had won. While love secured its victory among the stars, a much harsher reckoning was unfolding deep beneath the surface of the Earth. In the United Nations Global Command Bunker, the red emergency lights abruptly flickered and died, replaced by the stark, unforgiving glare of the standard fluorescent bulbs. General Vance stood frozen before the primary holographic map. The tracking icons representing his massive nuclear first strike had vanished, detonating harmlessly against the alien shielding. The retaliatory energy spikes from the dreadnoughts, the very beams meant to crack the planet open, had simply evaporated. Earth was completely silent. There was no fire. There was no ash. "General," the junior analyst whispered, her voice barely carrying across the cavernous room. "Communications are coming back online. The global defense grid is rebooting. The alien vessels are transmitting a universal broadcast." "Put it on," Vance demanded, his voice a hollow husk of its former arrogance. The screen shifted, displaying the silver-scarred face of Supreme Commander Vial. She did not look like a conqueror. She looked like a weary soldier offering a hand. "People of Earth," Vale's voice echoed through the command center, calm and resolute. "The Kaelan Armada stands down. Our hostile intent has been purged. We request immediate diplomatic channels to discuss reparations, medical exchange, and a mutual alliance." The command floor erupted into a chaotic symphony of cheers, sobs, and frantic embraces. The technicians realized they had survived the apocalypse, but Vance did not cheer. He stared at the screen, a cold realization washing over him. He had launched humanity's entire strategic nuclear arsenal without authorization. He had actively colluded with a mutinous alien warlord and nearly triggered the extinction of his own species out of sheer, blinding hubris. The heavy steel doors of the command center slammed open. A squad of heavily armed United Nations military police marched into the room, their weapons raised. Behind them walked the Supreme Secretary of the UN Peace Council, a stern woman whose face was etched with absolute fury. "General Vance," the Secretary announced, her voice cutting through the celebration like a blade. "You are hereby stripped of your command and placed under arrest for high treason, unauthorized deployment of weapons of mass destruction, and crimes against humanity. Surrender your sidearm." Vance looked at the military police, then back to the image of the alien commander on the screen. His grand political gamble had collapsed entirely. He unbuckled his holster, letting the weapon clatter onto the concrete floor. He was escorted out in silence, a disgraced relic of a warmongering past that humanity could no longer afford to tolerate. The political intrigue had reached its terminal conclusion, cleanly severing the rotten branches of human leadership. Back on the dreadnought, the chaotic transition of power had stabilized. The massive ship hummed with a new, vibrant energy. Arthur stood on the highest tier of the central bridge, gazing out the panoramic viewport at the breathtaking expanse of Earth. He had retrieved his cardigan, though it was now hopelessly stained with pale Kaelan blood, and he leaned heavily against the railing. His knees were aching fiercely, and he desperately wanted to sit in his rocking chair with a fresh glass of scotch. Heavy, metallic footsteps approached from behind. Vile stepped up beside him. She had removed her biomechanical helmet completely, allowing the harsh violet lighting of the bridge to illuminate her striking features. "The fleet is secure," Vielle said quietly. "My commanders are currently experiencing a severe existential crisis, but they are processing the data. They understand now. The harvest is canceled permanently. I imagine having your entire worldview rewritten in 30 seconds is quite a headache," Arthur remarked, a tired smile crossing his face. "A banter warned me it would be chaotic." "It was necessary," Vielle replied, turning her gaze to the blue and white sphere floating in the dark. "For 10,000 years, we believed that perfection was the absence of feeling. We mechanized our souls. We thought logic was the ultimate armor against the chaos of the universe." She looked down at the old history teacher. "You proved us wrong. Mr. Pendleton, you showed me that emotional vulnerability is not a flaw. It is the very engine of survival. Empathy allows a species to adapt, to forgive, to understand the value of a life beyond its mathematical utility. Without it, an empire is just a graveyard waiting to be filled." Arthur nodded slowly. "We humans are a messy bunch. Valerie, we make terrible mistakes. We let men like Vance get too much power, and we constantly teeter on the edge of destroying ourselves. But we also paint masterpieces. We build hospitals, and we look out for one another when the dark closes in. That friction, that constant struggle between our best and worst impulses, is what keeps us moving forward." He reached out and gently patted the heavy armor plating of her forearm. "I am very proud of the woman you have become. You earned an A+ today." Vielle smiled, a genuine, warm expression that completely transformed her terrifying visage. "Thank you, Arthur." The Supreme Commander of the Kaelan Armada and the retired high school teacher stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, watching the continents drift slowly far below. The war was over before it ever truly began, halted not by superior firepower, but by the stubborn, unconditional care of a man who refused to give up on his student. Yet, as Arthur watched the massive alien vessels holding their peaceful positions in orbit, he could not help but wonder what exactly a galaxy of highly emotional, technologically supreme warriors was going to do next. And more importantly, he wondered how his small, rural town in Iowa was going to react when a fleet of alien dropships arrived to help him replant his destroyed cornfield. Rebuilding a world is vastly different from conquering one, and the Kaelan Empire was about to learn that peace required a significant amount of manual labor. The towering black dreadnoughts did not leave Earth's atmosphere, but they no longer hung in the sky like executioners' blades. Instead, they became massive, floating embassies of an unprecedented galactic exchange. The Kaelan Armada possessed technology capable of reshaping reality, and they freely offered it to the fragile blue sphere below. Within weeks, Kaelan medical frigates descended on human hospitals, deploying the same emerald stasis gel that had saved Cyroc's life. Incurable diseases were eradicated in a matter of days. Clean, limitless energy generators replaced fossil fuel plants, healing the wounded ozone layer with terrifying efficiency. The United Nations, thoroughly purged of General Vance's warmongering faction, scrambled to formalize a treaty with a civilization that had abruptly shifted from apex predators to eager, highly emotional philanthropists. But the Kalins did not want gold, territory, or political submission in return. They wanted to go to school. The emotional broadcast that had saved Earth had also shattered the Kalin societal foundation. Millions of soldiers, engineers, and commanders were suddenly flooded with feelings they possessed absolutely no framework to process. They needed guidance. They needed an education in the messy, chaotic art of being alive. Humanity answered the call. Therapists, artists, musicians, and historians were shuttled up to the dreadnoughts in droves. The sight of a 7-foot-tall, biomechanically armored shock trooper weeping openly while listening to a human cellist play Bach became a regular occurrence. Alien commanders sat in newly formed classrooms, furiously taking notes on human literature, trying to understand the conceptual nuances of tragedy and romance. They were learning how to navigate the overwhelming tide of empathy, using Earth's vast cultural history as their compass. Far away from the global summits and orbital classrooms, a single Kalin dropship descended toward a quiet valley in Iowa. It did not crash this time. The vessel executed a perfectly calculated whisper-quiet landing on the edge of the scorched earth that used to be a prized cornfield. The heavy ramp lowered, touching the topsoil with the utmost gentleness. Arthur Pendleton stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. He took a deep breath, savoring the familiar scent of the Midwestern air. His house was still standing, though the porch was battered and the yard was a catastrophic crater of burned stalks and churned dirt. His favorite wooden rocking chair sat exactly where he had left it, miraculously untouched by the rotary wing ambush and the alien standoff. Behind him, Supreme Commander Vale and Cyrock descended the ramp. Vile had discarded her intimidating warlord aesthetic. Her armor was scaled down to a sleek, utilitarian configuration, lacking the heavy spikes and glowing weapon ports. Cyrock walked beside her, completely healed, his pale skin glowing with renewed vitality. Well, Arthur sighed, looking out over the ruined acreage. It is going to take a small miracle to get this soil ready for the next planting season. I suppose Banter can simply beam a new crop into existence with some sort of hard-light agricultural protocol. I am perfectly capable of synthesizing a hyper-accelerated biological yield. Banter's voice chimed from a small communication node attached to Vile's belt. It would require exactly 4 seconds and would be nutritionally superior to your primitive, ground-grown variants. No, Vile stated firmly, shutting off the AI's external speaker with a quick tap of her finger. She looked at Arthur, her violet eyes shining with a profound, quiet respect. We are not using the ship. We are not using hard light. Arthur raised a silver eyebrow. Valerie, I am 72 years old and I have a bad knee. If you expect me to till this entire field with a hand plow, you are going to be very disappointed. Cyrock stepped forward, holding a simple human-made steel hammer he had acquired from a local hardware store. He looked at the tool with intense fascination, turning it over in his hands. We have spent our entire lives relying on machines to enforce perfection. We conquered the stars, but we never learned the value of building something fragile with our own hands. We do not know what it means to nurture a living thing from the dirt. We want you to teach us. Vile reached into a canvas bag she had slung over her shoulder, pulling out a pair of heavy leather work gloves. She slipped them over her pale, iridescent hands. You taught me how to understand humanity in a classroom 20 years ago, Mr. Pendleton. Now, we need you to teach us how to rebuild. Slowly, inefficiently. Together. A wide, genuine smile spread across Arthur's weathered face. He walked over to his porch, lowering himself into the rocking chair with a satisfied groan. He pointed toward the ruined field. "All right then," Arthur commanded, slipping effortlessly back into his role as an educator. "The topsoil needs to be completely turned over. All the scorched debris has to be cleared out by hand, and we are going to need to reinforce the eastern fence line. I suggest you two get started. I will supervise from right here." Violin Cyrock shared a look of amused determination. The supreme commander of the Kaelin Armada and her brilliant engineer walked into the dirt, knelt down, and began to pull the burned roots from the earth one by one. It was a slow, agonizingly inefficient process, and it was entirely beautiful. As Arthur watched them work under the golden light of the setting sun, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over the farm. The universe was vast, cold, and filled with terrifying machines of war. But it was also capable of incredible, miraculous change. The Kaelin Empire had arrived to harvest a world, but instead, they had found their own lost souls. They had learned that absolute logic was a prison, and empathy was the key to the door. The story of the invasion would be written in the history books for generations to come. It would detail the collapse of the global defense grid, the political treachery of General Vance, and the desperate, high-stakes battle aboard the alien dreadnought. But Arthur knew the true turning point of the war was not a tactical maneuver or a plasma exchange. The universe was saved the moment a teacher decided to see the isolated, frightened girl hidden beneath the armor of a conqueror. Yet the galaxy remained vast and largely uncharted. The Kaelin High Council, secluded on their distant homeworld, had not yet received the full force of the emotional broadcast, and their reaction to Vale's localized treaty remained an ominous unknown. Furthermore, the sudden pacification of the Kaelin Armada created a massive power vacuum in the galactic arm, an opening that older, darker empires might soon exploit. Earth had survived its first encounter with the cosmos, but it was now irrevocably tied to the fate of the stars, and new challenges were already gathering in the deep dark. For now, however, the sky above Iowa was clear. The apocalyptic shadows of the dreadnoughts were gone, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of manual labor and the gentle creaking of a wooden rocking chair. Arthur took a sip of water, adjusted his spectacles, and watched his greatest student finally learn how to grow something beautiful. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the stars, please like, subscribe, and share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. I want to hear from you. So drop down into the comments and leave the word empathy to let me know you made it to the end. Do not forget to hit that hype button so this story can reach more viewers like you.